The first splinter of wood cracking was a sound so sharp, so final, it cut through the lazy Sunday morning quiet of our cul-de-sac better than any alarm. I was standing at my kitchen window, a mug of black coffee warming my hands, watching. I didn't turn on the news, I didn't check my phone. This was the headline. This was the broadcast. Mark, my neighbor, stood on the monstrosity he'd called a deck, a crowbar in his hands. He jammed it between two planks of expensive-looking Brazilian walnut and leaned his whole weight into it. The groan of protesting nails was a visceral, wounded sound. With a shriek of tormented metal, the board came loose, spinning end over end to land on the pristine lawn below, leaving a raw, pale scar on the deck's surface. It was the first of many. He had 60 days to reduce his pride and joy to a pile of kindling, and by God, he was starting day one with gusto. A part of me, a small, quiet part that had been curled up in a defensive ball for years, wanted to feel a surge of triumph. It wanted to throw open the window and cheer, but a deeper, wearier feeling prevailed. The profound, bone-deep satisfaction of a truth, long and patiently awaited, finally making itself known. I took a slow sip of coffee, the bitter heat of familiar comfort. I hadn't lifted a finger. I hadn't made a phone call or sent an anonymous email or even whispered a complaint over a backyard fence. All I had done was wait and watch. And in the end, that was all that was required. When Mark and his wife, a perpetually smiling woman named Lisa, moved in 10 years ago, the cul-de-sac, a cozy little loop of 6 houses we called the Crescent, bloomed with fresh, new neighbor energy. We were all families then. My daughter Chloe was 8, and the Thompson kids across the street were a whirlwind of bicycles and sidewalk chalk. Mark was all firm handshakes and easy smiles. He was a few years younger than me, radiating a kind of corporate polish I'd never quite managed.
"David, right?" he'd said, crossing the newly laid sod that divided our properties that first week. He thrust a cold bottle of some craft IPA into my hand. "Mark, this is Lisa. Looks like we're going to be sharing a fence." "Looks like it," I'd said, clinking my bottle against his. "Welcome. It's a good street. Quiet." "The best," he'd agreed, his gaze sweeping over my modest, well-kept ranch, then back to his own larger, more recently painted version of the same model. "We're looking forward to putting down roots." The first transgression was so small, so seemingly benign, that to have protested would have made me the lunatic he would later paint me to be. I was mowing my lawn, a Saturday morning ritual I found meditative. The smell of cut grass, the even lines, the tangible proof of care. I was halfway through the backyard when Mark pulled up on his zero-turn riding mower, a behemoth that looked like it belonged on a golf course. "Finish your beer, buddy!" he yelled over the roar of his engine. "I'll get this!" Before I could form a word, he'd swung the mower around and neatly buzzed off the remaining strip of my lawn along the property line. He did it with a theatrical flourish, giving me a thumbs up. He'd helped. My quiet ritual felt invaded. The neat, straight line I'd carefully maintained was now overridden by the arrogant, sweeping curve of his mower's turn. It was a tiny annexation.
"Thanks," I said, the word ash in my mouth.
"All about efficiency,"
he boomed, killing his engine. "Teamwork, right?" That was the hook. Teamwork. It implied a partnership I hadn't agreed to, a collapsing of the polite, necessary distance between two strangers who share a fence. The annexations continued. I'd be working in my home office. I've been a remote architectural draftsman for a decade, the job that suits my preference for quiet and order. And I'd see a FedEx truck pull away from my house, then immediately stop at his. I found out why when I went to retrieve a package I'd been expecting. "Mark took it for you," Lisa said brightly when I rang their bell. "He worries about porch pirates." He emerged from behind her, my box in his hands. Can't be too careful, David. This neighborhood is safe, but you never know. I'm home most days, so it's no trouble. He made it sound so reasonable. But the act was a declaration. I am watching. I am here. Your things are my concern. It was a subtle erosion of my own domain. I started getting emails from sellers. Your package was delivered to a neighbor, Mark. He had inserted himself into the logistical chain of my life, a self-appointed gatekeeper. The conflict first broke the surface over the trash bins. It was a universal constant of suburban life, the weekly rollout of the green and blue toters. I was meticulous about it. Tuesday night, after dinner, I'd wheel them to the curb. Wednesday evening, after the truck's rumble had faded, I'd bring them back, tucking them snugly against the side of the house, out of sight.
One Tuesday, I got home late from taking Chloe to a dentist appointment. The bins were still by the house. I was exhausted, the light was failing, and I decided it wouldn't be the end of the world to leave them for 1 week. The next morning, there was a formal letter in my mailbox. Not a flyer, not junk mail. A thick, cream-colored envelope from the Homeowners Association. "Dear Mr. David," it began, "it has been brought to our attention that your refuse containers are being stored in a manner that is unsightly and violates Covenant 7, Section 4B. Unsightly? They were against my own house, on my own property. I read the letter twice, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. There was a grainy telephoto lens photograph attached. It showed my bins from an angle that made them look like they were encroaching onto Mark's pristine driveway. The photo was taken from his property. I confronted him. Calmly, I thought, politely. I walked over, letter in hand. He was washing his car, whistling. "Mark, do you know anything about this?" He shut off the hose, took the letter, and scanned it with a look of profound sympathy. "Oh, geez, David, the HOA, they're a nightmare. Bunch of busybodies." He handed it back, his expression a mask of camaraderie. The phrase was a masterstroke. It reframed his aggression as my oversensitivity. I was the one making a fuss. I was the one who couldn't handle the normal, petty bureaucracies of suburban life. I was being unreasonable. The campaign of quiet erosion escalated. A noise complaint was filed with the HOA, citing loud late-night machinery coming from my house. The machinery was my dishwasher, which I ran at 9 p.m. A warning letter arrived about my garden shed, a 10-year-old structure that predated Mark by half a decade, claiming it was an eyesore and too visible from the street. The attached photos were, again, clearly taken from his second-floor window. I learned to stop talking to him. Every conversation was a trap. A friendly, "how's it going?" could be twisted into a complaint about my demeanor. I stopped inviting friends over for our occasional quiet barbecues, paranoid that the sound of laughter would be logged as a disturbance. I stopped waving to the other neighbors. What was the point? I could only imagine the portrait Mark was painting for them. David, the cranky, difficult hermit, the one who can't get along. My house, my refuge, began to feel like a fortress under siege. The blinds stayed half closed. I found myself moving quietly through my own rooms, hyper-aware of the sounds I was making. I was a ghost in my own home, and Mark was the cheerful, popular medium who had convinced everyone I didn't exist, or that if I did, I was best left alone. The lowest point came 2 years into Mark's quiet war. It was a small thing in the grand scheme, but it was the one that broke something inside me. It was Chloe's 16th birthday. She was living primarily with her mom across town by then, our time together relegated to alternating weekends. But she'd wanted to have a few friends over at my place for a movie night. Just 5 girls, pizza, and a superhero marathon. I was thrilled. It filled the empty, quiet house with a life it desperately needed.
They were in the living room, the sounds of cinematic explosions and youthful laughter spilling into the hallway. I was in the kitchen, loading up a tray with popcorn and sodas, a contented smile on my face. The doorbell rang.
It was a police officer, a young, serious-looking woman. My heart plummeted straight through the floor. "Sir, we've had a complaint about a possible underage drinking party at this residence." The words were a physical blow. I stammered, my face flushing. No, officer, it's my daughter's birthday. They're watching movies. There's pizza and soda. That's it." I invited her in. She saw the truth immediately. 5 wide-eyed teenagers surrounded by pizza boxes and candy wrappers. The only smell was pepperoni and popcorn. She was apologetic, professional. "We have to follow up on all calls. Sorry to have disturbed you folks." After she left, the party was dead. The laughter was forced, the movie forgotten. The girls left early. Chloe was mortified, her eyes shiny with unshed tears. "Why would someone do that, Dad?" I knew why. I looked out the window. Mark's living room curtain twitched back into place. I didn't confront him. What would have been the use? He would have given me that same infuriatingly placid smile. "You're taking things too personally, David. Someone must have seen the cars and gotten the wrong idea. It's a safe neighborhood, you know. People are vigilant." That night, after driving a quiet, withdrawn Chloe back to her mother's, I sat in my dark kitchen. A cold, hard stone of resignation had settled in my gut. This was my life now. This was the landscape. Fighting him was pointless. He was a master of plausible deniability, a sniper firing from the high ground of suburban propriety. Any retaliation from me would only confirm the narrative he'd so carefully constructed. I was the problem. So I stopped. I stopped trying to be friendly. I stopped trying to defend myself. I became what he had made me, a quiet, withdrawn man who kept to himself. I tended my lawn, I paid my bills, I did my work. I became a still, silent pool of water. And still waters, as they say, run deep. Then, about a year ago, the sounds of war were replaced by the sounds of construction. Mark was embarking on his magnum opus, the deck. It started with a surveyor's stake, then another, marking the corners of his grand design. The project was audacious. It wasn't just a deck. It was a multi-leveled outdoor living space, complete with plans for a built-in hot tub, a full outdoor kitchen with a granite countertop, and a pergola shrouded in what would eventually be wisteria. He showed me the plans, of course, unrolling the blueprints on his hood one Saturday morning with the flourish of a conquering general. "Going to add some real value to the place, David," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Might even boost your property value a bit by association." I forced a smile. My eyes weren't on the fancy grill or the hot tub. They were on the property lines sketched on the plan and the proposed structure that seemed to be awfully close to them. Awfully large, too. I knew decks. I'd spent 3 years after college working for a contractor, building them. It was hard, honest work that had paid my way before I transitioned to drafting. I knew the municipal code for our area like the back of my hand because I'd had to study it for permits. There were rules, setbacks. A deck of this size needed to be at least 10 feet from the property line. This one looked to be maybe 6. And any structure over 200 square feet required a specific engineering permit. This was pushing 400. Easy. He started digging the footings. I watched from my window, the professional part of my brain ticking off the violations as they manifested in wood and concrete. The posts went in, too close to the line. The frame was built, sprawling and massive.
He'd hired a couple of day laborers, but he was the foreman, the visionary, barking orders and basking in the noise and the chaos. The Thompson kids, now teenagers, would stop and watch, wide-eyed. Mark would pause, wipe the sweat from his brow, and give them a lecture on the importance of investing in your home. He was the king of the cul-de-sac, building his castle. Lisa would bring him lemonade. "Isn't it amazing, David?" she called over to me once as I was checking my mail. I replied, "It's certainly something." Every hammer strike, every roar of the circular saw was a violation. But I said nothing. I didn't call the city. I didn't mention the permits. I just watched. I became a student of his hubris. I took a strange, cold comfort in the certainty of it all. He wasn't just building a deck, he was building his own scaffold. The summer he finished it was the longest of my life. The deck was his stage, and he was perpetually on it. There were parties every weekend, the clinking of glasses, the smell of expensive steak on the grill, the loud, braying laughter of his friends. The hot tub bubbled constantly, a cauldron of steam and noise. The music was always just a little too loud, the conversations just a little too boisterous, carrying clearly into my office, my bedroom, my life. He'd see me in my yard and raise a glass. "You should come over sometime, David. Live a little." The invitation was never sincere. It was a taunt, a reminder of my exclusion. He had built the social hub of the neighborhood, and I was the lone house, dark and silent beside it.
One evening, I was out watering my flower beds, a futile attempt to maintain some small piece of beauty in the shadow of his monolith. Mark was holding court on his deck with a couple I recognized from 3 houses down, the Johnsons. "And let me tell you," Mark was saying, his voice carrying easily in the still air, "the permit process was a nightmare. The city, you know, but you have to know how to work the system. A few well-placed calls, and suddenly the inspections just smooth themselves out." It was a lie, a bald-faced, grandiose lie. There had been no permits, no inspections. He was not only a cheat, he was a braggart. He was inflating his own cleverness by detailing a crime he'd committed. Mr. Johnson laughed, a nervous, sycophantic sound. "You're a brave man, Mark. I wouldn't know the first thing about that." "It's not bravery," Mark said, sipping his drink. "It's about understanding that these rules aren't for guys like us. They're for the people who can't think for themselves." His gaze drifted across the fence and landed on me, hunched over my petunias. He gave me a slow, deliberate smile. I felt a hot flush climb my neck. In that moment, he wasn't just stealing my peace, he was spitting on the very concept of order, of rules, of the quiet, patient contract that holds a society together. He believed the world was his to manipulate, and people like me were just obstacles or audience members for his performance. I turned off the hose and went inside. The stone of resignation in my gut had transformed. It was no longer cold. It was hot and hard and sharp. It was no longer resignation. It was patience. The patience of a geologist watching a mountain form, knowing that the same forces of pressure and time that built it up would inevitably bring it crashing down. The morning the inspectors came, the air was crisp, holding the first faint promise of autumn. I was at my drafting table, fine-tuning the elevation drawings for a library edition. The work required a deep, focused calm, a state I had become an expert in cultivating, out of sheer necessity. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision broke my concentration. 2 men in crisp, city-issue polo shirts and carrying clipboards were walking purposefully down the sidewalk. One had a long, yellow measuring tape reeled on a holder at his hip.
They had the officious, unhurried gait of men whose authority was never questioned. They stopped at the foot of Mark's driveway. They consulted their clipboard. One of them pointed at the deck. My heart gave a single, hard thump against my ribs, like a starting gun had been fired. I didn't move. I didn't go to the window and press my face to the glass. I simply watched from the shadows of my office, my pencil frozen in my hand. This was the play. I would not miss a moment. Mark emerged, his smile wide and welcoming. I saw him offer a handshake. The lead inspector took it, but his posture remained rigid. Words were exchanged. Mark's smile didn't falter, but it became fixed, a little tight around the edges. He was gesturing, explaining. I could imagine the patter. Oh, the permits? They must be inside. My wife handles all that. We absolutely went through the proper channels. The inspector with the measuring tape was already unspooling it. He walked to the corner of the deck, placed the metal end at the base of a post, and walked straight towards my property line. He didn't need to go far. He stopped, looked at the tape, and called out to his partner. 6 feet 2 inches. The words, though muffled by the double-paned glass, were clear enough. They hung in the quiet air. A death sentence.
The rest was a grim ballet. More measuring. The tape snaking across the deck's vast surface. The lead inspector making notes on his clipboard, his face an impassive mask. Mark's hands were on his hips now. Then they were in his hair. His explanations became more animated. I saw Lisa come to the door, her hand flying to her mouth. The lead inspector finally looked up from his clipboard and spoke to Mark. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw their effect. Mark's shoulders slumped. The entire performative, confident architecture of his body collapsed. The inspector reached into his bag, pulled out a bright red tag, and, with a brutal finality, stapled it to the main post of the deck. The red tag fluttered in the morning breeze, a tiny, defiant flag marking the fall of an empire. The inspectors left. Mark stood alone on his illegal deck, staring at the red tag as if it were a venomous snake. He stood there for a long, long time. I finally turned away from the window. My drawing was waiting. The lines needed to be straight. The perspectives needed to be true. The confrontation came that evening. The doorbell rang, a harsh, insistent sound I rarely heard. I knew who it was. I took a deep breath, centering myself. I was not the frantic one. I was not the one who had been caught. I opened the door. Mark stood there, his face a thundercloud. He was holding the red-tagged citation, crumpled in his fist. He thrust it at me, his hand shaking with rage. "You," he spat, the word venomous. "You did this." I looked at him. I looked past the rage, past the bluster, and saw the raw, terrified little boy underneath. I met his eyes and held his gaze. I let the silence stretch, let it become uncomfortable. I made him stand in it. Then I spoke. My voice was calm, flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a man stating a simple, undeniable fact. "Mark," I said, "you're taking things too personally." For a second, he just stared, his mouth slightly agape, as if I'd spoken in another language. The words, his words, my words for so long had finally been returned to their sender. The recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by a fury so pure it seemed to suck the air from the porch. He took a half step back, as if I'd physically struck him. He didn't say another word. He just turned, the citation fluttering from his limp hand to my welcome mat, and walked back to his house, to his condemned deck, to the ruins of his own making. He never spoke to me again. The demolition took weeks.
It was not the swift, professional deconstruction of a crew, but the slow, agonizing, piecemeal disassembly of a broken man. He did it himself, on weekends and after work. There was no more music, no more parties, just the rhythmic, percussive sound of a crowbar prying wood from wood, the screech of nails, the splintering of expensive lumber. I watched him sometimes. There was no joy in it, no schadenfreude. It was a somber, almost religious spectacle. He was performing a penance for the sin of his own arrogance. Each plank he tossed into a rented dumpster was a brick he had laid in the wall of his own isolation. The street grew quiet again, the true, deep quiet of a settled neighborhood, not the tense, watchful silence of a Cold War. The Thompsons started walking their dog again in the evenings, waving to me as they passed. I started waving back.
One Saturday, I was planting tulip bulbs along the fence line, the one he'd tried so hard to blur. The dumpster was finally gone. His backyard was a patch of scarred earth, a blank slate. Mark was pressure washing his patio, a smaller, permitted one that had been there all along. He didn't look at me, I didn't look at him. But as I pressed a bulb into the cool, dark soil, I felt a sense of closure. It was over. The ghost could finally leave his fortress. The siege was lifted. I hadn't gloated. I hadn't told a soul on the street what I knew, what I had seen coming from a mile away. I didn't need to. The truth had done its own work, in its own time. My revenge wasn't in his downfall. It was in my freedom. Freedom from his noise, his manipulation, and most of all, freedom from the need to fight him. Because sometimes the best revenge is just living well. It's realizing that life, with its impeccable sense of timing and its unwavering commitment to cause and effect, will do the heavy lifting for you. All you have to do is have the patience to get out of the way and stop trying to fix people who are so diligently, so proudly building their own undoing. The soil was rich and dark in my hands. It was time to plant something new. What's the most satisfying moment of quiet revenge you've ever witnessed or experienced? Share your stories in the comments below.